So with an understanding of these options out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at what is generated when these test cases are created. So I went ahead and created several examples using a variety of combinations of these options, and let's take a look at them in Workstation. So to begin with, let's start by just looking at a new project. This is a brand new project I created just to give you an idea of what artifacts are in here already. Our virtual service folders are empty, our subprocesses folder is empty, there's an audit doc, one suite doc, two staging docs, our project config, and an empty data folder. And if we open the project config, we can see that that also is empty. So this is a really good, again, baseline to have to look at what an empty project looks like, or a brand new project, and then we can look at a new project that has had baselines added to it, and that'll help us understand what all the artifacts are that get generated when you create a baseline test case from CA/CAI. I have a project open here that has the baselines that we created using the expanded options. And let's go ahead and take a look at the project tree and go through the artifacts that have been generated by this process. So what we have here is on top, instead of the virtual services being the first folder, now we have a folder called baselines. And this folder was created by CA/CAI when it generated the expanded baseline test cases. And we can see there are three subfolders. Each of these subfolders now brings to light the three-part names that are generated in the process of creating the baseline test cases. So if we look in these folders, the test cases have real generic names, baseline 1, baseline 10, 2, etc., for all the different transactions that we generated baselines for. But the folder itself is where those three different parts that were mentioned earlier come into play. So we have the very end, when we click Create, you can see this part here, which is the EXP for expanded. We created this one with test steps, and this is the first version of it. So we can see this part we created, then we named the transaction set, LB add 10 users for Lisa Bank, adding 10 users, and then there's the date and time stamp that these were created. So this is where those different parts, giving them meaningful names, can be very helpful in distinguishing what exactly is in these folders, because otherwise the name of these is just baseline. So we'll look into those test cases a little bit more deeply in a moment, but let's go ahead and head down to the test folder. We can see there's no subprocesses, still only one audit document, and then now we have three suite documents which actually match up with these names. So again, these meaningful names help you know which suite of test cases you're going to run. So in each of these, the test cases in these folders are already preloaded in here, and they're already set to run in one right after the other, so you don't have to do that manually. You can just run one of these suites and it will go ahead and take care of running each test case one after another. And you don't have to make these manually. That's one of the great parts, is all this stuff is so automated. Now in the staging documents area, we still only have two staging documents. We can see no new config files have been made, but there have been some changes to the project config, but we'll look at that in a moment. And if we open the data folder, again, the meaningful names help us figure out that there are 10 data sets here, and they're associated with the expanded baseline test cases that use the test steps and the database validation steps. Let's take a look at the details of the files that are created, or the artifacts. And let's start with the first set of baselines here, the expanded baselines using test steps. Open the folder and we can see there are 10 baseline test cases, one for each transaction. If we open the test case itself, we can see here that there is a web service execution XML test step, and it is what is going to invoke the system using the add user object. So the transactions that we shelved were web service execution transactions, so this is the type of test that is generated by CA/CAI when it makes the baseline. So depending on what type of transactions you shelve, you're going to get different test steps in here to match up with those. So let's go ahead and open this step, and we can see that we have the request here containing the data from the transaction that was captured, and this is going to be all the data that's going to be sent over as part of the request to add the user, to do the add user operation. And you can also see here that there's some properties that are in place in this endpoint URL. There's the WS server and the WS port. Below, we can see how the actual URL is with these properties. So let's look at the properties that are available right now, going through the properties pane, in the project config. So by changing this to config properties, we can see what is actually in this project config file now. And we can see the WS server and the WS port, our app server in 8080. So by creating these baseline test cases, CAI also updated the project config file. And we can see here, this is a real easy way to take a look without opening the project config file as to what properties are actually in there. So these test cases are also pulling from your project config file, which most of the properties that are in here are going to be your environmental based properties, ones that help you connect to a database or connect to a different part of the system. Okay, we'll go ahead and close this. And we can see we have two assertions that are also part of this test step. And the first one is assert response code equals, and the next one is assert response equals. So we'll look at the first assertion. And what this is going to do is it takes the response code that came back and was captured by CAI, and it creates an assertion that says, if you get a response code that is different, in this case, than 200, say you get a 404, then fail the test. So this is one level of validating that the system is working. It's going to check that the response code is correct. And then there's also the assert response equals assertion. And what this does is it has a hard-coded control, which we format, we can see. It has the expected response from the captured data in CAI, and then after it executes this step, it saves the response into a property called last response, and it populates the test column. And then it does an assertion, and it checks that the control and the test are the same. And if these two are not the same, if it turns out false, then it fails the test. So this is the part that's used in regression testing. You have an expected result that should be the result or the response that you would get back when the system is operating correctly. And then you get your last response, which is the actual response from the system under test. And if they don't match, then something has been introduced that has changed this. And it's an indication that there's a potential defect. So this is how these baseline test cases work. They invoke the system, and then they do a check here to make sure that the expected response and the actual response match. And so as you can see here, this is just one single test step, and each one of these test cases has one single test step like this, just with different transaction data. So again, this is the expanded version. This is where every transaction will get its own baseline test case.